Wires, jute cord, some modeling paste, paint, and common scenery material. That's all it took to create this mesmerizing and eye-catching model tree with intricate visible roots encapsulating the crumbling brick building. Here the roots just don't cling on the walls, but interweave through broken windows and edges to move in 3 dimensions, and then leading your eyes towards that beautiful and airy foliage, just like the real thing. How did I build this? Well, stick around, I'll show you. But wait, where did that little brick structure come from? And what is the sculpture about? I have discussed the preamble and shown the making of the brick walls in the previous episode where I used air drying clay and watercolor to build this crumbling brick structure mimicking those in the Ross Island in the Andamans. So please check that out. Who better than Gordon Gravett to ask help from in this occasion? Though I have built quite a few highly detailed model trees before, drawing inspiration from his methods proved very helpful. I highly recommend this book for anyone embarking in serious model tree making. Link in the description below. It has to be a wire tree, so I took 2 different gauges of florist wires, 28 and 24. I also needed some thinner wires for finer branches, so for that I stripped a 30 gauge single strand electrical wire and cut foot-long strands. The tree in itself would be divided into 2 main halves on 2 sides of the corner of the building, essentially occupying the central part of the circular base and hiding the joint of the 2 walls. I used a few 24 gauge wires to make an L shape to create the first base for the outside half of the root column. A 30 gauge piece of wire held the strands together while I twisted the shorter ends to make roots on the ground. I separated a few strands and branched off from the middle and made additional roots. Roots are more twisted and intertwined than upper branches. I paid special attention to distribute them naturally along the walls. Coming to the upper branches, I followed natural branching of the wires. Note that thicker 24 gauge wires make more prominent twists with sharper peaks and valleys, so they would take more sculpting material later and will form much thicker branches even if they look relatively thin now. See how I am loosening some twisted wires to create a natural spread in the roots. Here, one thick branch crosses the wall to the other side through one of the arched windows. Once the base structure of the 2 main halves were done, I joined them right at the top of the corner spot of the walls. Did you notice that there is a little gap that is left between the top of the wall and the tree? We will come back to that after a while. Creating tree branches from wires is an art in itself, where you spend time carefully shaping them in natural bends and distribute them to form the shape. Unlike my previous trees, this one had to be constricted within the dome, so I made sure the structure doesn't go out of bounds. For additional roots, I took inspiration from some of the photos. For one of the outside walls, I went for the weird lunging leg type formation that I saw in one of the key reference photos. It was very amusing not to have it. For the other wall, I decided for 2 different types of roots. First one would be a very fluid structure with relatively thin roots interwoven with each other and flowing down like water. The other one was intended to cover the entire top and side edge like a frame. Now, trees have a lot of thinner branches and twigs. In the past, I've used polyfibers for these, where I could spray paint the branches and twigs together and blend them. However, considering I have the finished walls to think about, taking a spray paint can near the model was not an option. I turned to a cord of jute, cut a small piece, and separated the threads and the strands by teasing them out gently with my fingers. I made black and grey dye by mixing India ink and chalk paints in 2 buckets. I divided my clump of jute fibers in 2 parts, completely soaked them in the colored water and left for a day or 2. Then the jute fibers were taken out, dried and mixed together to produce a finely balanced, naturally variant shade of grey with hints of light brown here and there. Perfect for twigs I have in mind. To sculpt the roots and the bark, I used acrylic modeling paste. It works similar to Woodland Scenic's latex rubber, but it's much cheaper alternative that is easily available in art supply stores. I also thought of using chalk paints to tint the paste, an experiment really to find out how it works. The first round was easy. I took an old brush and dabbed the paste to cover the wires, paying special attention to cover the unnatural twists and binding wires that go around the roots or the trunk. I started with the lunging leg root. See how I'm leaving some wires free in the end and not sculpting them yet? That is related to the gap we left between the two halves of the main tree. We will come back to that later. The main tree structure had a thorough coat of paste all over. The layer needs to be quite thick to cover those twists and joints in the base wire structure, an important thing to remember while making wire trees. If the base wire structure itself is as thick as the final tree, you'll eventually land with a tree that is double the thickness. Any sculpting material will shrink when dried, and as you can see, the underlying twists and wires are visible again. So it is time for a second round of sculpting. From this round on, the roots and the bark need to be handled differently. Roots in real life have relatively smoother finish and a lighter color. Now, intricate twists and turns are common and natural in the real roots, but I made sure to cover any trace of the binding wires and long stretches of twists to make a smoother outer layer. A thick layer of sculpting continued for the main trunk and the branches. Notice that for the terminal branches, I'm sculpting a gradual transition from thicker mother branch to the thinner children to make them look more natural and fluid. A light layer was added on top of the previous one to smooth out the surface and replicate a smoother characteristics of the roots. Now the final round, the bark texture. I made a brownish grey batch of the modeling paste by adding a little bit of raw sienna to the previous grey mix. This time I took an old brush and applied the paste in a stipple motion. This is a hard bristle brush, and the stipple motion creates tiny little rise and valleys in the gel. Once dry, that effect would make a convincing bark texture, as we will see. It's time for painting. Starting with the roots, first I dry brush light grey and off-white to bring that lighter tone you see in the roots. The medium grey base automatically brought in a natural variation in tone and color and provided that necessary shading. To add some earth tone, I took light mix of raw umber and grey and applied in random fashion. Now roots in these little islands often have those colorful patches. I don't really know what that is and how they are formed, so if some of you are aware, then please leave a comment below. To simulate these patches, I took some diluted sap green, yellow ochre and off-white, dipped my old and deformed hard bristle brush in them, and started spattering tiny drops of paint on the trunk. Once the droplets dried, I took very diluted light grey chalk paint to tone down any sharp contrast and blend them to the base tone. It's a very easy to do effect that produces unique and excellent results and brings a model tree much closer to the real thing. Now that the roots are done, it's time to fix them to the wall, starting with the main structure of the tree. I carefully positioned the tree in its place and used super glue to fix the loose ends of the roots on the inside. I made sure that the corner of the building is hidden by the roots on both sides. The roots on the outside were much heavier and needed something more reliable than super glue. I drilled small holes through the root to the wooden base and used small brass pins to secure them. The pins will eventually be covered in earth and scenic material later on. Now the tricky part, attaching the additional roots. I started with the lunging leg first. Now it's time to answer that question. The non-sculpted wires of this root go through the gap between the two halves of the main tree, right above the wall. The idea is that once the wires go through the gap, they will be shaped to form more branches on the other side and then sculpted to blend with the main structure. But there is a problem. The little branch that I made that looked like an offshoot from the root is in the wrong place and won't let the roots fit in position. And then I made a very smart decision to try to push fit it. And guess what happened next? Yep, you got it right, a lot of cursing. Shit. So back to my senses, now I took a decision that I should have taken some time ago. Chop that little branch off. Then I repaired the broken piece with some superglue. I was saved in this occasion since I was building a ruin anyway, so it doesn't really matter if I ruined it a bit more. Let's call it weathering a ruin. I fixed the roots to the base with some pins. Then the portion that touches the wall received a generous dose of superglue and was pressed with the wall. The loose, smaller roots were twisted tight with the gaps in the broken walls to really give that feeling of clinging on the structure. It had a few hiccups, but in the end, it worked out exactly the way I envisioned it. Moving to the other wall, I slightly twisted and shaped the roots so that it hugs the wall snugly enough. One big advantage of acrylic modeling paste is how flexible it is. I could not only shape the roots even though it is fully sculpted and detailed, I could even bend them to whichever orientation I wanted. This is a huge advantage over traditional sculpting materials like plaster or clay. I got my modeling paste mix and filled any unnatural gaps between the roots and the structures and sculpted some extensions of the roots since I had mixed a larger batch than what I needed. These will also help blend those roots well with the ground. Once the base layer for these new parts dried, I added the bark and root textures following the same method as before. This helped hiding all the evidence of different parts that were used in building the complex structure and completed the illusion that it is one big tree encapsulating the walls. Some branches were trimmed as well to construct the overall shape within the dome. I made a brownish gray wash to apply throughout the trunk. This wash is to add shading and make recesses and crevices prominent. Once the wash dried, I took some light gray and raw umber, dry brushed it on the trunk to highlight the crests, making the bark prominent. It's time to bring back the dyed jute into action. First step was to tease out little pieces from the clump and shape them to form twigs. I took some matte medium to use as glue. First I applied the matte medium on the branches where I wanted to place the twigs, and then I simply pressed a bunch of jute fibers. Matte medium is an excellent glue that leaves no shine and also works pretty fast. When applying any fibers to make little branches and twigs, whether it is jute fiber or more familiar polyfibers, it's important to ensure that they don't look like a clump of hairball. One trick is to take just a few longer strands with two open ends, fold the bunch in the middle, and then glue where the strands are folded. This makes sure that the branches look natural, and also with a little practice, it is much faster to achieve the realistic effect. I mixed some earth tones, mostly yellow ochre and raw sienna, with acrylic modeling paste to make the base layer of the crown. You can see that the paste is pretty diluted to aid better flow. I made a circular dam with 6mm Tamiya masking tape to stop any of the paste to overflow. Starting on the inside, first I filled a small gap between the beveled concrete base and the edge. I took a palette knife to smoothen the top surface. I also buried the roots around the edge to blend them well to the scenery. Rest of the diorama was easy. I took generous amount of the paste and covered the remaining bare base. When filling the void in that intricate maze of roots, I buried the roots partially. The masking tape was removed before the modeling paste can take hold. Any excess on the wooden base was removed with a wet paper towel. Once the paste dried, I took some diluted raw umber to add some shading on the ground. Next is dirt. I created a new dam so that the dirt and the scenic glue don't overflow and ruin the nice wooden base. For the dirt itself, I took some dry flower pot earth and did a 2-stage sieving through a tea strainer first and then through a piece of fine stocking to get some really fine dirt. I added some beige grout with this to make my scenic spread. To apply the dirt and fix it properly to the base, I needed scenic cement. For this, I took some matte medium gel and diluted it with water. I applied the diluted matte medium using a brush and then spread the fine dust on it. The matte medium secures the first layer of dirt with the acrylic base very well. I also applied some dirt on the concrete surface on the inside of the building and in some areas of the brick wall to simulate remaining mortar or dust deposit. I mixed demineralized water and 99 proof IPA to make wet water, or water with very little surface tension that can flow much better than normal water. I also mixed another batch of matte medium and water, and this time added a drop of dishwashing soap, again to reduce the surface tension. First step is to wet the whole surface with the 50% IPA. Since IPA has very little surface tension, it penetrates deep into the dirt layer and soaks it thoroughly to activate the layer to receive the scenic glue that is coming next. Notice that the water is flooding some areas. I took a toilet paper and very gently held it on top of the flooded areas to remove excess water. Next, I repeated the steps with the scenic glue. Again, the low surface tension of the glue helped it reach every nook and cranny of the dirt layer. Then I took a wet brush and cleaned the top of the roots and areas where I didn't want a thick layer of dirt. The masking tape was removed as things were still wet, and the diorama was left for 24 hours for everything to dry. It's time for the big transformation, leaves. I used Noch Leaves of medium and light green color. To fix the leaves, I used heavy-duty hairspray. Starting with the lower branches, first I sprayed the hairspray carefully, avoiding the main branches and roots as much as possible. Then took a pinch of leaves and sprinkled on the area where I sprayed the glue. I took the advantage of the small size of the diorama and sprayed from the underneath to get a good coverage of the lower branches. Notice that I'm applying a natural mix of medium and light green color leaves. For some targeted application to difficult to reach areas, I made a cardboard cone and sprayed through the cone to avoid spreading the glue all over the finely painted and detailed trunk. The process continued for the whole tree till I got a good and natural distribution of leaves. It is impossible to avoid some overspray on the trunk, resulting in leaves being stuck where you don't want them. I took a hard bristle brush and a pair of tweezers to eliminate any rogue leaves trying to occupy a place where they don't belong. To add a little bit of highlight and to bring more vibrance in the tones, I sprinkled a very little amount of yellow and rust color leaves. It's time to seal all the work done so far using a generous coat of flat clear lacquer. As the lacquer dried, I did a little cleanup, clipping some of the unruly and unnatural looking little twigs and branches and reshaping some of them. I realized I needed a browner tone on the ground, otherwise it was looking awfully lot like sand. I followed the same steps to add patches of darker dirt and fix them with scenic glue following the same methods as earlier. Notice that since there is enough dirt to soak up the little amount of water and glue, no masking tape was used this time. Did you notice that there is one wall that still doesn't have anything growing on it? That's because the plan was to make a vine that would cover most of it. I took some long strands of jute fiber, teased and shaped them to form natural vine structure, and glued some woodland scenic coarse foam using hairspray. Then I glued them on the wall, spreading it almost through the whole of it. To finish detailing the ground, I used 2mm static grass and applied in smaller patches using my precision static grass applicator. I teased them to shape using a thin skewer. Then added some 4mm static grass around the periphery to add some variety in size and make it look natural. I sprinkled a little yellow and brown Noch leaves on the ground to simulate dried leaves. Small amounts of woodland scenic coarse foam were added to show some bushes and shrubs. Now, how can I have wild bushes and shrubs without some wild flowers? So I applied a little bit of scenic glue on the shrubs and then added woodland scenic's white and yellow wildflowers in small patches here and there. Well, who'd have thought a small little vignette fitting inside a 5-inch IKEA dome could be so engaging? Frankly, I didn't. I do hope that you enjoyed this 2-part series, learned from my experiments, and this inspired you to try something new and push your boundaries. Which of these techniques will you try for your models? Let me know in the comments below. Make sure to check out my realistic diorama playlist for more engaging diorama making videos. Until next time, have fun making miniatures.